The radio crackles with dying screams as Captain Sarah Chun listens to her team's final transmission from Firebase Delta. We're down to our last magazine. Martinez is bleeding out. They're everywhere. Sergeant Rodriguez's voice cuts through static before an explosion drowns out everything. Command's cold voice declares the mission terminated, but Chun sees something on the thermal imaging that makes her blood freeze. Enemy reinforcements moving to execute survivors. She grabs her sidearm, storms past the duty officer trying to stop her, and sprints toward the damaged transport plane sitting on the tarmac. The engines are still warm. The command bunker fell silent except for the steady hum of electronics and the distant rumble of generators. Captain Sarah Chun stared at the tactical display, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the metal table. Red dots representing her team members flickered weakly on the screen, some steady, others blinking erratically, and 3 had already gone dark permanently. Firebase Delta, this is Overwatch. Report status. The radio operator's voice carried the mechanical detachment of someone who had already written off the mission. Static answered him, punctuated by the distant pop of gunfire that sounded like firecrackers through the poor connection. Colonel Morrison stood behind Chun, his weathered face carved from stone. It's over, Captain. We've lost contact with the extraction team, and satellite imagery shows at least 2 companies of enemy forces converging on their position. He placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. Your people fought well, but, sir, with respect, they're still fighting. Chen's voice cut through the colonel's eulogy like a blade. She pointed at the thermal readouts streaming across her monitor. Look at these heat signatures. Rodriguez has them in a defensive position near the old communications tower. They're not dead yet. Morrison leaned over her shoulder, squinting at the grainy images. Those could be anything, Captain. Equipment fires, burning vehicles. The radio suddenly burst to life with Rodriguez's voice, distorted but unmistakably alive. Overwatch, this is Delta 6. We are combat effective with 8 wounded, 3 critical. Enemy forces have us surrounded, but we're holding the high ground. Request immediate. An explosion cut off the transmission, followed by the steady hiss of dead air. Chun's heart hammered against her ribs. 8 wounded. That meant at least 12 of her people were still breathing, still fighting, still believing someone would come for them. She watched the thermal display as new heat signatures appeared on the perimeter. Enemy reinforcements moving in for the kill. Colonel, we have to... Negative. Morrison's voice carried the finality of a coffin lid slamming shut. I'm not throwing good money after bad. The extraction bird is down. We have no assets in the area, and intelligence indicates this was a trap from the beginning. He turned away from the display. Mark Firebase Delta as Kier and prep the after-action report. The duty officer, a pale lieutenant who looked like he'd never seen combat, reached for the radio controls. All stations, this is Overwatch. Mission Lazarus is terminated. Repeat, Mission Lazarus as Chun's hand slammed down on the radio, cutting off the transmission. The bunker erupted in shocked silence. Morrison spun around, his face flushing red. Captain, you are out of line. Sir, those are my people out there. Chun's voice remained steady, but her eyes blazed with something dangerous. I trained them. I led them into that valley. And I'm not abandoning them to die because some desk jockey thinks the math doesn't add up. The math is simple, Captain. We have no viable extraction options, no close air support available, and no ground units within 50 kilometers. What exactly do you propose we do? Wish them home? Chun turned back to her workstation, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she pulled up aircraft manifests and maintenance reports. Transport 77 is still on the tarmac. Took some shrapnel during the morning raid, but the engines are functional. Morrison followed her gaze through the bunker's reinforced windows to where the battered transport plane sat under harsh floodlights. Its hull was pockmarked with bullet holes. One wing showed scorch marks from a near-miss rocket, and hydraulic fluid leaked in dark puddles beneath the fuselage. That aircraft is grounded pending full inspection. The maintenance chief red-tagged it 6 hours ago. The maintenance chief isn't watching his team die on a mountainside. Chun pulled up the plane's technical specifications. She fly, sir. Maybe not pretty, maybe not safe, but she fly. Even if that flying coffin could make it to the valley, which I doubt, you'd be landing in the middle of a firefight with no backup and no way out. It's suicide. Chun's fingers paused over the keyboard. Through the radio static, she could hear the faint sound of automatic weapons fire her people. Still fighting, still hoping. She thought about Rodriguez, who had a newborn daughter he'd never met. About Martinez, bleeding out in some rocky foxhole. About Thompson, barely 19, and scared of his own shadow until Chun had taught him to be a soldier. Permission to take Transport 77 and attempt extraction, sir. Permission denied. You're too valuable to lose on a fool's errand. Chun stood slowly, her chair scraping against the concrete floor. Then I'm not asking permission. She unclipped her sidearm from its holster and checked the magazine. 15 rounds of 9mm, plus 1 in the chamber. Not much, but it would have to do. Morrison's eyes widened. Captain, if you walk out that door, you'll face court-martial for disobeying direct orders. If I don't walk out that door, I'll face something worse. Chun holstered her weapon and headed for the exit. I'll face the mirror every morning for the rest of my life, knowing I left good soldiers to die because it wasn't convenient to save them. The duty officer stepped into her path, his hand hovering uncertainly over his own sidearm. Ma'am, I can't let you. Chun's training kicked in. She grabbed the lieutenant's wrist, twisted sharply, and sent him stumbling into a bank of communications equipment. Alarms began blaring as switches flipped and circuits shorted. Sorry, Lieutenant. Nothing personal. Morrison shouted orders behind her, but Chun was already through the blast doors and running across the tarmac. The night air hit her like a slap, thick with the smell of aviation fuel and cordite. Transport 77 loomed ahead, its damaged hull looking like a wounded beast in the harsh lights. The crew chief, a grizzled sergeant named Kowalski, emerged from beneath the aircraft with a wrench in his hand and grease stains on his coveralls. Captain, what are you doing out here? This bird's grounded until... How long to get her airborne, Sergeant? Kowalski glanced back at the plane, then at Chun's determined expression. Ma'am, she's got hydraulic leaks, the starboard engine's running rough, and the navigation system's been glitchy since this morning. I wouldn't trust her to fly to the mess hall, let alone. How long? The sergeant studied her face for a long moment, seeing something there that made him nod slowly. 5 minutes to run through the pre-flight. But Captain, if you're thinking what I think you're thinking, I'm thinking my people are dying while we stand here talking. Chun climbed into the cockpit, her hands automatically finding the familiar controls. The seat still held warmth from the previous pilot, and the instrument panel glowed softly in the darkness. Behind her, she could hear Morrison's voice echoing across the tarmac, shouting orders to stop her. Security personnel were already running toward the aircraft, their boots pounding against concrete. Chun's fingers danced across the startup sequence. The engines coughed, wheezed, then roared to life with a sound like controlled thunder. The aircraft shuddered and vibrated, but it was alive. She keyed the radio one last time. Firebase Delta, this is Guardian Angel. I'm coming to get you. Hold fast. The response came immediately, Rodriguez's voice crackling through the static. Guardian Angel negative. It's too hot down here. They'll blow you out of the sky. Chun smiled grimly as she released the brakes and felt the damaged transport begin to roll. Then I guess I'll have to fly faster than their bullets. Chun's aircraft screams through a wall of tracer fire that lights up the night like deadly fireworks. A rocket punches through her starboard wing, sending the plane into a violent spin as alarms shriek in the cockpit. Blood streams down her face from flying glass, but she can see muzzle flashes below. Her team is still fighting. Enemy fighters scramble to intercept her, their missiles streaking past her cockpit windows. Chun throws the transport into a suicidal dive, using the mountains as cover while the aircraft sheds pieces like a dying bird. She spots the landing zone, a narrow strip of road between burning vehicles, barely long enough for a motorcycle, let alone a transport plane. The transport plane lurched violently as Chun pushed the throttles to maximum, the damaged engines screaming in protest. Behind her, the airbase fell away into darkness. But ahead lay something far worse, a corridor of death that stretched 40 kilometers through enemy-controlled airspace to Firebase Delta. Guardian Angel, this is Tower Control. You are ordered to return to base immediately. Repeat, return to base. The radio crackled with increasingly frantic commands. But Chun had already switched to the tactical frequency, where her team's desperate voices painted a picture of hell on Earth. Delta 6. This is Guardian Angel. ETA 12 minutes. What's your situation? Rodriguez's voice came through bursts of static and gunfire. Guardian Angel, we've got approximately 60 hostiles in a tightening perimeter. They're using the old mining road to bring up heavy weapons. Martinez is critical, took shrapnel to the chest. We need immediate extraction, or we're not lasting another hour. Chun checked her instruments. Fuel was adequate, but the starboard engine temperature was climbing into the red zone. Hydraulic pressure fluctuated wildly, and the navigation system kept resetting itself every few minutes. She was flying a wounded bird into the mouth of hell. But her people were counting on her dot. The first indication of enemy air defenses came as a streak of light that passed so close to her cockpit. She could feel the heat through the reinforced glass. Chun threw the transport into a sharp bank to the left, the aircraft groaning under the stress as another surface-to-air missile exploded where she'd been seconds before. Wow, that's not good, she muttered, scanning the darkness below for muzzle flashes that would indicate anti-aircraft positions. The enemy had been busy since shooting down the extraction helicopter. They'd moved portable SAM sites into the valley approaches, creating an overlapping field of fire that turned the entire area into a no-fly zone. The radio erupted with a new voice enemy communications that her equipment had intercepted and automatically translated. Air target approaching from the south. All units engage. Do not let it reach the Americans. Chun smiled grimly. At least she had their attention. The next missile came from directly ahead, its exhaust trail drawing a line of fire across the night sky. Chun pulled back on the stick, sending the transport into a steep climb that made the engines howl and the airframe shudder. The missile passed beneath her, its proximity fuse detonating close enough to pepper the belly of the aircraft with shrapnel. Warning lights cascaded across her instrument panel like a Christmas tree designed by a sadist. Hydraulic pressure dropped to critical levels. The port engine began running rough, and she could smell smoke seeping into the cockpit. But the aircraft was still flying, still carrying her toward her people. Guardian Angel, break off. Break off. Rodriguez's voice carried pure panic. They've got you bracketed. There's too much fire. Chun ignored him, focusing instead on the tactical display that showed Firebase Delta's position. Her team had taken shelter in the ruins of an old communications station built into the mountainside, using the concrete structures and natural rock formations to create interlocking fields of fire. But the enemy was closing in from 3 sides, and thermal imaging showed heavy weapons being moved into position for a final assault. Another missile streaked up from the valley floor, this one tracking her heat signature with deadly precision. Chun cut power to both engines and threw the transport into a dive that would have made a fighter pilot proud. The missile, confused by the sudden loss of heat signature, flew past and exploded harmlessly against the mountainside. But cutting the engines had consequences. The transport was now a 40-ton glider with the aerodynamic properties of a flying brick, dropping toward the valley floor at an alarming rate. Chun fought to restart the engines while maintaining enough airspeed to avoid stalling. The port engine coughed to life first, followed reluctantly by the starboard. But she'd lost precious altitude and was now well within range of small arms fire. Tracer rounds began streaming up from the darkness like deadly fireworks, creating a web of light that the transport had to navigate. Chun jinked left and right, using every trick she'd learned in flight school and a few she'd improvised over the years. A burst of machine gun fire stitched across her starboard wing, punching holes that whistled in the slipstream. "Guardian Angel, we have visual on your position." Rodriguez's voice carried a mixture of hope and terror. "You're taking heavy fire." The LZ is compromised. Chun could see it now, the narrow strip of road that served as Firebase Delta's emergency landing zone. It was barely 300 meters long, carved into the mountainside between burning vehicles and scattered equipment. Under normal circumstances, it would be a challenging landing for an experienced pilot in perfect conditions. Tonight, with a damaged aircraft under enemy fire, it was borderline impossible. But impossible was just another word for Tuesday in Chun's vocabulary. A rocket-propelled grenade streaked past her cockpit, close enough that she could see the fins spinning as it flew by. The explosion behind her lit up the night and sent shock waves through the aircraft that rattled her teeth. More RPGs followed, creating a gauntlet of fire that she had to thread while maintaining her approach to the landing zone. The starboard engine suddenly seized with a grinding shriek of tortured metal. The transport yawed violently to the right as the dead engine created massive drag, threatening to send the aircraft into an unrecoverable spin. Chun fought the controls, using rudder and aileron to compensate while the remaining engine screamed at maximum power. "Come on, you beautiful bitch," she whispered to the aircraft, coaxing every ounce of performance from the dying machine. Just a little further. Enemy fighters appeared on her radar, two fast movers climbing from a hidden airstrip deeper in the valley. They'd be on her in minutes, and a damaged transport had no chance against dedicated interceptors. But Chun wasn't planning to be in the air that long. She lined up on the landing zone, now clearly visible in the light of burning fuel and muzzle flashes. Her team had marked the approach with infrared strobes that showed up clearly on her night vision, creating a path through the chaos. But the path was narrow, and enemy forces were converging on both sides of the makeshift runway. "Delta 6, I'm coming in hot. Clear the LZ and prepare for immediate extraction." "Guardian Angel, negative. It's too dangerous. They've got the approach zeroed." Chun ignored the warning, dropping the landing gear and extending what remained of her flaps. The transport shuddered and bucked like an angry horse, but she held it steady on the glide path. Tracer fire converged on her position from multiple directions, turning the night into a deadly light show. A heavy machine gun opened up from a position directly ahead, its bullets walking up the runway toward her aircraft. Chun could see the muzzle flashes, could calculate the trajectory, could see exactly where the rounds would intersect her flight path. She held course anyway. The bullets began striking the aircraft's nose, spiderwebbing the windscreen and sending sparks flying from the instrument panel. Chun ducked instinctively, but kept her hand steady on the controls. The landing zone rushed up to meet her, a narrow strip of salvation surrounded by an ocean of death dotted the last second. She saw movement in her peripheral vision, an enemy soldier with a shoulder-fired missile, the weapon already tracking her approach. The man's finger was on the trigger, the missile-seeker head locked onto her heat signature. Time slowed to a crawl as Chen realized she was about to die. The landing is pure chaos, Chun's plane hits the ground at twice the safe speed, bounces 30 feet into the air, and slams down again as the landing gear collapses. The aircraft slides sideways through enemy positions, its wings shearing off and spinning like a massive blade that cuts down advancing soldiers. Before the plane stops moving, Chun kicks out the emergency exit and rolls into a firefight, her pistol barking as she covers Rodriguez, dragging wounded soldiers toward the wreckage. She spots an enemy sniper drawing a bead on her medic and puts 2 rounds center mass without breaking stride. The fuel leak from her destroyed plane creates a river of fire that splits the battlefield in half. The shoulder-fired missile streaked toward Chun's cockpit like a comet of death, its exhaust trail painting a line of fire across her vision. She had perhaps 2 seconds before impact, not enough time to evade, barely enough time to think. Instead of pulling up or banking away, Chun did something that defied every instinct screaming in her brain. She pushed the nose down and dove straight at the runway. The missile, programmed to track heat signatures, couldn't adjust quickly enough to the sudden change in trajectory. It screamed over the transport's tail section, missing by mere feet before exploding against the mountainside in a shower of rock and flame. But Chun's evasive maneuver had cost her precious altitude and control. The transport hit the makeshift runway at nearly 200 kilometers per hour, far beyond the aircraft's design limits. The impact sent shockwaves through the airframe that Chun felt in her bones. The main landing gear, already weakened by shrapnel damage, collapsed immediately under the stress. The aircraft bounced like a skipping stone, climbing 30 feet into the air before gravity reclaimed it with violent authority. The second impact was catastrophic. The nose gear crumpled, sending the transport's belly grinding against the rocky surface in a shower of sparks and screaming metal. Chun fought to maintain some semblance of control as the aircraft slewed sideways, its momentum carrying it off the narrow runway and directly into enemy positions. Through her shattered windscreen, Chun saw enemy soldiers diving for cover as 40 tons of out-of-control aircraft bore down on them. The starboard wing, already damaged by missile fragments, caught on a concrete barrier and tore away from the fuselage with a sound like the world ending. The severed wing tumbled through the air like a massive blade, its jagged edge catching 3 enemy soldiers who had been advancing on Rodriguez's position. They disappeared in a spray of blood and twisted metal dot. The transport continued its death slide, carving a furrow through sandbags, equipment, and anything else unfortunate enough to be in its path. Chen's head snapped forward as the aircraft finally ground to a halt against a pile of rubble, the sudden stop throwing her against her restraints hard enough to crack ribs. For a moment, the battlefield fell silent except for the hiss of escaping steam and the crackle of flames. Chun's ears rang from the impact, and blood ran down her face from a dozen cuts inflicted by flying glass. But she was alive, and more importantly, she could hear Rodriguez's voice shouting orders somewhere in the darkness. "Guardian Angel is down. Guardian Angel is down. All units converge on the crash site." Chun fumbled with her restraints, her hands shaking from adrenaline and shock. The cockpit was filling with smoke from electrical fires, and she could smell aviation fuel, a deadly combination that meant she had minutes, maybe less, before the entire aircraft became a fireball. She kicked at the emergency exit, but the frame had warped in the crash and the door wouldn't budge. Chun drew her sidearm and put 3 rounds into the hinges, then threw her shoulder against the door. It burst open, dumping her onto the rocky ground just as enemy forces began to recover from the shock of her dramatic arrival. The first thing Chun saw was muzzle flashes, enemy soldiers firing from positions around the crashed transport. The second thing she saw was Rodriguez, 30 meters away, dragging a wounded soldier toward the relative safety of the aircraft's bulk. The third thing she saw was an enemy sniper positioned on a rocky outcrop. Drawing a bead on her medic, Chun's pistol was in her hand and firing before conscious thought caught up with instinct. 2 rounds center mass dropped a sniper before he could pull the trigger. She rolled behind the aircraft's landing gear as return fire sparked off the metal around her. Rodriguez. Status report. Guardian Angel, thank God you're alive. Rodriguez's voice carried relief and desperation in equal measure. We've got 8 wounded. 3 critical. Martinez is unconscious but breathing. The enemy pulled back when you crashed, but they're regrouping for another assault. Chun assessed her situation with the cold calculation of a professional soldier. The crashed transport provided excellent cover, but it was also a death trap if the fuel ignited. Enemy forces had them surrounded on 3 sides, with only the steep mountainside behind them offering any hope of escape. Her team was exhausted, low on ammunition, and burdened with wounded who couldn't move quickly, but they also had advantages the enemy didn't expect. The crash had scattered burning aviation fuel across a wide area, creating a barrier of fire that split the battlefield in half. Enemy forces on the far side of the flames would have to circle around to reach them, buying precious time. More importantly, the transport's bulk provided cover for a defensive position that could hold against superior numbers. All Delta units, fall back to the crash site. Chun's voice cut through the chaos with the authority of command. Use the aircraft as cover and establish interlocking fields of fire. Wounded to the center, walking wounded on the perimeter. Her team moved with the precision of soldiers who had trained together for years. Thompson, barely 19 but steady under fire, dragged Martinez toward the aircraft's tail section. Williams, the team's demolitions expert, began setting charges around the perimeter to create choke points. Rodriguez coordinated the movement of wounded while maintaining suppressive fire on enemy positions. Chun spotted movement in her peripheral vision and enemy squad, trying to flank their position using the cover of burning debris. She put 2 rounds into the lead soldier, then shifted her aim to catch the second man as he tried to find cover. Her pistol clicked empty, and she smoothly ejected the magazine while reaching for a spare. Captain, Williams called out from behind a pile of twisted metal. I've got charges set, but we're running low on ammunition. Maybe 20 rounds per man, less for the wounded. Chun slammed a fresh magazine into her pistol and chambered a round. Then we make every shot count. Rodriguez, what's our extraction timeline? Unknown, ma'am. Command wrote us off, remember? We're on our own until his words were cut off by the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar. Chun threw herself flat as the first round exploded 20 meters away, showering the area with rock fragments and shrapnel. More rounds followed, walking closer to their position with each impact. They're bracketing us, Thompson shouted over the explosions. Next salvo's gonna be right on top of us. Chun's mind raced through their options. They couldn't stay where they were. The mortar fire would eventually find its mark. They couldn't retreat up the mountainside with wounded soldiers, and they couldn't advance through the enemy positions with their limited ammunition. But they had one asset the enemy hadn't counted on. Several hundred gallons of aviation fuel scattered across the battlefield like an accelerant waiting for ignition. Chun smiled grimly as she reached for Williams' demolition kit. Sometimes the best defense was a really spectacular offense. Williams, how much C4 do you have left? About 2 pounds, ma'am. Why? Because we're going to turn this valley into hell on earth. Chun turns the crashed transport into a fortress of death, directing her team to use the wreckage's armor, plating while she calls in danger-close artillery strikes on her own position. The enemy, caught between the burning fuel and precision bombardment, breaks and runs. But Chun isn't finished. She leads a pursuit through the smoke, her team moving like ghosts through the chaos, systematically hunting down the scattered enemy forces. When the dust settles and reinforcements arrive, they find Chun standing atop a pile of captured weapons, her uniform torn and bloody, but her eyes blazing with victory. The lost mission has become a massacre for the enemy. Chun grabbed William's demolition kit and began pulling out blocks of C4 with the methodical precision of someone who had done this before. The mortar rounds were getting closer. The last salvo had landed close enough to shower them with debris and fill the air with the acrid smell of high explosives. "Ma'am, what's the plan?" Rodriguez asked, reloading his rifle with one of his last magazines. "We're going to use their own tactics against them." Chun pointed to the streams of aviation fuel that had spread across the battlefield like veins of liquid death. "Williams, I need you to place charges along the fuel lines, small ones, just enough to ignite the vapor. When I give the signal, we turn this entire valley into a furnace." Williams' eyes widened as he understood the implications. "Captain, Matt's going to create a firestorm. We'll be right in the middle of it. Better to die in fire than let them execute us one by one." Chun's voice carried the cold certainty of someone who had already accepted the worst possible outcome. "But we're not dying today. Rodriguez, get on the radio and see if you can raise any friendly aircraft. Tell them we're about to light up the entire grid square." As Williams began placing charges, Chun studied the enemy positions through the smoke and flames. The mortar team was set up on a ridge about 400 meters to the east, protected by a squad of infantry. 2 machine gun nests controlled the approaches from the north and south. While a larger force was massing for a final assault from the west, they had her team outnumbered at least 4-1. But numbers meant nothing if you could control the battlefield. "Charges set, Captain," Williams called out, his voice barely audible over the increasing tempo of enemy fire. Chun keyed her radio, switching to the emergency frequency that would reach any friendly forces in the area. Any station. This is Guardian Angel at Firebase Delta. We are about to initiate Danger Close fire mission on our own position. Repeat, Danger Close on our own position. Any aircraft in the area, stand by for target illumination." Static answered her for several seconds. Then a voice crackled through an A-10 pilot somewhere in the darkness above. "Guardian Angel, this is Hawkeye 7. I've got eyes on your position and multiple hostiles in the area. Are you requesting close air support?" "Negative, Hawkeye 7. We're about to create our own fireworks. Stand by and watch for targets of opportunity when they break cover." Chun looked around at her Team 8 soldiers. Half of them wounded, all of them looking at her with the kind of trust that came from shared combat. They knew the odds, knew they were probably going to die, but they were ready to follow her into hell if that's what it took. "Listen up." Chen's voice cut through the chaos. "When I detonate these charges, this entire area is going to become an inferno. Stay low, stay behind cover, and when the fire dies down, we hunt. No prisoners, no mercy. These bastards wanted a fight. Let's give them one they'll never forget." She held up the detonator, her thumb hovering over the trigger. Enemy soldiers were advancing through the smoke, their muzzle flashes getting closer with each passing second. A mortar round exploded so close that the shockwave knocked Thompson to his knees. Chun pressed the button. The world exploded into light and heat as aviation. Fuel ignited across a 100-meter radius. The flames roared skyward like the breath of an angry god, turning night into day and creating a wall of fire that separated friend from foe. Enemy soldiers caught in the open screamed as the flames engulfed them, their weapons firing wildly as they tried to escape the inferno. The heat was intense even behind the aircraft's protection, but Chun's team had prepared for it. They had soaked their clothing with water from their canteens and covered their faces with wet cloth. The enemy, caught completely off guard, had no such protection. Through the flames, Chun could see enemy positions being abandoned as soldiers fled the advancing fire. The machine gun nests fell silent as their crews retreated, and the mortar team on the ridge stopped firing as they tried to relocate to safer ground. "Now," Chun shouted, leading her team around the edge of the flames. "Hit them while they're scattered." What followed was not a battle, but a hunt. Chun's team moved through the smoke and chaos like avenging spirits, their weapons speaking with deadly precision. Rodriguez took out the fleeing mortar crew with a series of well-placed shots. Williams used his remaining explosives to collapse a rocky overhang onto a squad of enemy soldiers trying to regroup. Chun herself moved like death incarnate, her pistol finding targets with mechanical precision. An enemy soldier emerged from behind a boulder, his rifle swinging toward Thompson. Chun put 2 rounds in his chest before he could fire. Another tried to surrender, hands raised. But Chun saw the grenade in his palm and shot him before he could release the spoon. The A-10 pilot above watched the carnage unfold with professional admiration. "Guardian Angel, this is Hawkeye 7. I've got multiple enemy vehicles fleeing your position. Request permission to engage." "Permission granted, Hawkeye 7. Light them up." The distinctive sound of the A-10's GA-U-8 cannon echoed across the valley as the pilots strafed the fleeing vehicles. Explosions bloomed in the distance as enemy reinforcements were turned into scrap metal and smoke. Within 20 minutes, the battle was over. The valley that had been swarming with enemy forces was now a graveyard of burning vehicles and scattered equipment. Chun's team had not only survived, but had turned a desperate last stand into a complete rout. As the flames died down and the smoke began to clear, Chun stood atop a pile of captured weapons and equipment. Her uniform was torn and bloody, her face streaked with soot and cordite, but her eyes blazed with the fierce satisfaction of victory snatched from the jaws of defeat. Rodriguez approached, supporting Martinez, who was conscious but pale from blood loss. "Captain, we've secured the perimeter. Enemy casualties are extensive. We've got enough captured weapons and ammunition to outfit a company." Chun nodded, then keyed her radio. "Overwatch, this is Guardian Angel. Firebase Delta is secure." "Repeat, Firebase Delta is secure. We have 8 wounded requiring medical evacuation and enough captured intelligence to keep the analysts busy for months." The response came immediately, Colonel Morrison's voice, filled with disbelief and something that might have been respect. "Guardian Angel, confirm your status. Are you saying the mission is successful?" Chun looked around at her team, battered but alive, then at the valley floor littered with enemy dead and burning equipment. "Affirmative, Overwatch. Mission accomplished. The enemy force has been neutralized and we're ready for extraction." As the sound of approaching helicopters filled the air, Chun allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. They had been written off, abandoned, left to die. But they had refused to accept defeat, had turned their funeral pyre into the enemy's grave. When the extraction birds landed and the medics rushed to treat the wounded, Chun was the last aboard. She took one final look at the valley where her team had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious. Sometimes, she reflected, the best way to win was to refuse to lose.